Yeah, so what can we do about resistance at the farm level from all the experience we've had? Well, really, it can all be summarised in one word: diversity. Now that, when we get right down to it, is a field by field and farm by farm. And what diversity is for a Iowa corn grower is different to an Australian wheat grower, but the principles are never reliant on one tactic alone. For example, herbicides, I always say, if you're getting great weed control with a herbicide, change it. Change it while it's working. While it is working, change it so you give yourself a better chance of that same herbicide working in the long term. And the worst thing is using the same herbicide every year, no diversity. So diversity is all about using the herbicide tools, but diversifying, changing them every possible chance, and using any non-herbicide tools that make economic sense. Yeah, how important are the weeds that are in what we call the soil seed bank? They're really important because in the main, this year's weeds, that is, this year's weed seed that enters the soil seed bank is next year's weeds. And really good farmers run their weed seed banks to very low levels. It's very difficult battling very high seed banks of weed seeds. And the objective should be get those soil seed banks of weeds, numbers of weeds per square yard or any other measure in the soil at low levels. It's possible. You can do it. And then use the herbicides on low weed populations, not on massive populations, because that's when resistance can easily evolve. So what gets in the way of people doing some of these more sustainable practices? Well, it's just easy to go and use the herbicide. I wouldn't argue with that. It is easy to use the herbicide, but you want to make sure the herbicide's going to work. And what we've learnt the hard way is that if you keep using herbicides and nothing else, then eventually they're going to fail due to resistance. So that's the first stumbling block, is realising, hey, I've got to be more diverse than simply reaching for the same jug every time. I should reach for every possible jug and mix them up and diversify them and put any other non-chemical tools in there, and that way it'll work in the long term, not just the short term. Is scouting a big deal? Yeah, you should know what your problem is out there. But really, scouting is, if you can see them, there's a problem there. So it's really thinking about it before then, thinking about that seed bank, making sure those numbers, if they are high, get them to low levels, preferably non-chemically. But if you've got to do it chemically, diversify your chemicals. So it's all about, we're going to go back to what we used to be like in the past, where we had to really think about the weeds. It wasn't just going out and spray glyphosate every time there's any weeds. We couldn't do that before. We're going to be back in that situation, and it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible to get on top of these problems, but the only way is with a diversified strategy. I always say, if I've got 5 herbicide choices, use all 5 of them. Not in 1 year, obviously, but for example, for our lay-by, pre-emergent foundation treatment, on my farm we've got 3 herbicides that we can use. So my objective is use 1 every 3 years. Rotate them, diversify them, so that you give the best chance of all 3 of those remaining for the future. So what am I frustrated about? Really, it's about our failure to recognise how precious these herbicides are. Glyphosate, for example, is simply the world's greatest herbicide. It is a 1 in 100 year chemical. It is as important for world food production as penicillin is for human health. And yet we are abusing that precious chemical resource. That's a frustration to me because I know that glyphosate is a 1 in 100 year discovery. There are no new glyphosates to be picked off the shelf. They come along as often as penicillin comes along, and I wish we could regard them for what they truly are, precious resources. And some of these new ones, glufosinate or Liberty, for example, we should regard that as a precious resource for current and future harvests, not something we just spray every time we see some weeds. You know, I'm sure you understand my frustration because I do know that there are very few new chemicals coming along. There'll be a few, but not many. So we should regard the ones we have as truly precious resources and try to keep them going as long as possible. And for heaven's sake, at the farmer's level, what are we interested in? We're interested in having that chemical work for as long as possible on a particular farm. That's the objective. Can we maintain conservation tillage when we've got resistance? There's 60 million acres, at least in Australia, that says yes, but only through diversity. For example, on my farm, it's all no-till. Everything's no-till. But we have to diversify, use non-chemical tactics and diversify our chemicals to mix up our forms of weed control because we must keep no-till. Non-chemical tactics are anything that makes economic sense on the farm that doesn't involve the chemicals. I'll give you a few examples. One is straight good agronomy, narrow row spacing, high seeding rates, make the crop as competitive against the weed. Then we practice what we call harvest weed seed control techniques. These are techniques designed to stop any surviving weeds from producing seed. Right now, no American farmers are practicing what we call weed seed control techniques. There's a prediction for the future. US farmers will be doing things for weed control that they cannot imagine doing right now. They'll do it in the future because they need to control these weeds. And you watch creative minds and creative farmers come up with non-chemical solutions when the herbicides stop working.